Welcome to Crime Drama TV. Please note, the stories we share are works of fiction inspired by real-life events. To protect the privacy of those involved, all names and details have been altered. Now, sit back and enjoy the drama.
Married. She was married. The thought danced in Sienna Blake's mind as she stood under the dazzling light of the grand chandelier, the delicate lace of her wedding dress skimming the floor. Her heart felt so full it could burst. She glanced at the crowd of familiar faces, family, friends, and even the nosy neighbors who never missed a chance to gossip. Yet none of them mattered in that moment. All she could see was Evan. Evan Blake. Her husband. The word sent shivers of joy through her. He was everything she'd dreamed of. Dependable, kind, and hers. Standing at the altar earlier that afternoon, he'd looked so sure, his sandy blonde hair catching the sunlight, his blue eyes locked on hers with a tenderness that melted away any lingering doubts. The way his hands had trembled as he slid the ring onto her finger wasn't nervousness. It was emotion. She was certain of it. The ceremony had been beautiful, every detail as perfect as she'd imagined. As the pastor declared them husband and wife, Evan's kiss had been soft but lingering, a promise sealed in front of everyone they loved. She'd walked back down the aisle on his arm, her cheeks aching from the smile she couldn't stop wearing. Now, as the reception unfolded, laughter and clinking glasses filled the room. Sienna watched Evan, who had just finished a toast, as he moved through the crowd with effortless charm. The soft glow of the candles lit up his features, making him look like the hero of every romance novel she'd ever read. She was his, he was hers. This was their forever. A bond forged in secrets. But forever had cracks that Sienna couldn't yet see. Years earlier, long before Sienna entered his life, Evan had forged a bond with Alvin Cross, the kind of friendship that small towns like Sandusky rarely allowed to flourish openly. Alvin had been the first person to make Evan feel seen, not as the perfect golden boy of their high school football team, but as a human being with complexities and fears. Their first kiss, stolen on a quiet autumn night by the lake, was burned into Evan's memory. It had been a moment of clarity and confusion, one that left him questioning everything he thought he knew about himself. The fear of rejection, of becoming an outcast in a town that clung to tradition, had kept him silent. But the connection between them deepened, hidden in the shadows of bonfires and late-night drives. When Alvin left for college and Evan stayed behind to shoulder his family's responsibilities, their lives diverged. But the bond and the secret that tethered them remained. Years later, when Alvin returned to Sandusky with the quiet confidence of a man who had made peace with himself, it was as though no time had passed. A single stormy night, with rain battering the windows of the hardware store, was all it took for their connection to reignite. Now, at Evan's wedding, Alvin stood near the back of the room, his sharp gaze lingering on the man he could never fully have. The polished suit and calm demeanor couldn't disguise the storm of emotions brewing beneath the surface. Watching Evan now, so polished and poised, Alvin felt a twinge of something he hated to name: regret, a quiet storm. Inside the buzzing reception, Sienna glided through the crowd, her laughter bright as champagne flushed her cheeks. Yet, between smiles, her eyes searched for Evan. Outside on the veranda, Evan leaned against the railing, his thoughts churning as Alvin stood nearby, casual yet piercing. A cool breeze stirred the autumn leaves. "She doesn't notice?" Alvin's voice cut through the quiet. Evan stiffened. "Notice what?" "How distant you are," Alvin said, softer now. "She deserves better. She's too good for this." Evan's jaw tightened. "I know. I love her. I chose her because—" His words faltered. "Because she's safe," Alvin finished, bitter and sad. Evan slumped. "This isn't fair." "No," Alvin replied, stepping closer. "But you made this choice. So what now? A life of pretending?" Before Evan could answer, the doors creaked open. Abby, the maid of honor, appeared, her gaze sharp. "Your bride's looking for you, Mr. Blake. Don't linger too long." Evan left with a nod, leaving Abby to eye Alvin. "Not causing trouble, are you?" she asked lightly. "Just catching up," Alvin replied, his smile thin. Abby didn't seem convinced, but disappeared inside, leaving Alvin alone in the cool night air. Threads begin to unravel. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of the Blake home. Sienna, still in the afterglow of her wedding, hummed to herself as she prepared coffee in their cozy kitchen. The sunlight highlighted the copper streaks in her auburn hair, and she wore one of Evan's oversized button-ups, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Evan entered quietly, his expression unreadable as he leaned against the doorframe. His tie from the night before was still draped loosely around his neck. "Morning, Mr. Blake," Sienna said, her voice light and cheerful. She handed him a steaming mug. "I still can't believe it. We're married." Evan forced a smile, taking the mug from her hands. "Yeah, we are." Her brow furrowed slightly as she caught the hesitation in his tone. "Are you okay?" she asked, stepping closer to him. "Just tired," he replied quickly, taking a long sip of his coffee to avoid her gaze. The moment passed, and Sienna let it go, attributing his mood to exhaustion from the long night of celebration. She wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head against his chest. "I love you," she murmured, her voice soft and genuine. Evan froze for a moment before wrapping his arms around her. "I love you too," he said, though the words felt heavy on his tongue. Unbeknownst to them, Alvin sat in his car parked a block away, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He had driven by their house without meaning to, drawn by something he couldn't name. Through the front window, he could see their silhouettes, Evan holding Sienna in what looked like a tender embrace. A pang of something sharp and unwelcome twisted in his chest. The sight was a reminder of what he could never have, and for a moment, Alvin considered leaving Sandusky for good. But as he gripped the steering wheel tighter, his jaw set with determination. If Evan was going to bury the truth, Alvin wasn't sure he could keep doing the same. Doubts take root. Sienna's happiness carried her through the first weeks of married life. Their small home became her canvas, and she delighted in turning it into a space where they could build their future together. Evan's laughter when they cooked dinner, or his quiet compliments when he caught her sketching, filled her heart with joy. Every moment felt like a step toward a dream realized. But cracks, small and nearly imperceptible, began to form. The phone calls started first. Evan stepped out of the room more often now, his voice hushed but calm. She told herself it was work. He'd mentioned how much busier the store had gotten lately, yet when they sat together in the evenings, a lingering distraction hung in the air. Still, Sienna wanted to believe. That's why she planned a surprise dinner, cooking his favorite meal and setting the table with candles, a small nod to the romance they'd shared on their honeymoon. By the time the clock ticked past 8, her phone buzzed with a text. "Sorry, working late. Don't wait up." Her stomach twisted, disappointment welling up, but she pushed it down. "It's just one night," she murmured, extinguishing the candles and wrapping the plates for the fridge. Meanwhile, Evan wasn't at the store. He sat in a booth at the corner diner, his coffee untouched. Across from him, Alvin leaned back against the vinyl seat, his sharp eyes fixed on Evan. "You've barely looked at me all night," Alvin said, his voice laced with frustration. Evan sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. You think this is easy for me?" Alvin leaned forward, his tone sharp. "I came back because of my mom, not to watch you pretend you're someone you're not." Alvin had returned to Sandusky just 2 months earlier, leaving behind a promising position in Chicago to care for his ailing mother. It wasn't the plan, but family came first. He'd stayed, taking a consulting job remotely, thinking he could handle being back. He hadn't counted on Evan's wedding dredging up old feelings. "I love her, Alvin," Evan said softly, meeting his gaze. "But He hesitated, the words dying on his tongue. "But you love me too," Alvin finished for him, his voice bitter. Cracks began to show. When Evan returned home that night, the house was dark except for the dim light of the kitchen. Sienna sat on the couch, her knees drawn to her chest, the soft glow of a lamp casting a warm halo around her auburn hair. The untouched dinner sat on the counter, covered in foil. "You're late," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Yeah," Evan murmured, slipping out of his coat. "Things ran over at the store." She gestured toward the table. "I made dinner for us." Evan's heart twisted. Guilt flickered across his face, and he walked over to sit beside her. "I'm sorry, Sienna," he said, his tone genuine. He reached for her hand, wrapping his fingers around hers. "I didn't mean to let you down. I'll make it up to you." Sienna studied him for a moment, her green eyes searching his face. Finally, she sighed and rested her head on his shoulder. "Just be here, Evan. That's all I want." "I know," he said, kissing her hair and holding her close. He meant it too. In that moment, with Sienna in his arms, he felt a deep love for her, one that made the weight of his secrets even harder to bear. Later that night, as Sienna slept soundly beside him, Evan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Alvin's words from earlier played in his mind on a loop. "But you love me too." The warning days turned into weeks, and though life in the Blake household seemed picture-perfect on the surface, a quiet tension simmered underneath. Sienna noticed Evan's frequent absences and the faraway look that often crossed his face when he thought she wasn't watching. She didn't press, yet. Love meant trust, and she wanted to give him the space she assumed he needed. But Sandusky wasn't the kind of town where secrets stayed buried. It was during a morning trip to the local farmer's market that Sienna bumped into Alvin. He was polite, even charming, as they exchanged pleasantries among the rows of fresh produce and local crafts. Sienna's instinct told her something was off, though she couldn't quite place it. "You're Evan's friend, right? From high school?" she asked, tilting her head as she studied him. "That's right," Alvin replied, his smile barely touching his eyes. "We've known each other a long time." There was a weight in his tone, something unsaid that hung in the air. "I appreciate you being there at the wedding," she said, trying to fill the silence. It meant a lot to Evan. Alvin's jaw tightened ever so slightly. "I'm sure it did." Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a message from Abby, reminding her of their lunch plans. As Sienna glanced down at her screen, Alvin stepped closer. His voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "Do you ever wonder if Evan tells you everything?" The question froze Sienna in place. She looked up, confused and a little alarmed. "What do you mean?" Alvin shook his head, forcing a light chuckle. "Nothing. Forget I said anything." He grabbed a bag of apples from the stall and nodded toward her. "It was nice seeing you, Sienna. Take care." As Alvin walked away, Sienna stood rooted to the spot, her mind racing. She wanted to dismiss his words, chalk them up to nothing more than an awkward attempt at conversation. But the seed of doubt he'd planted took root, and no matter how much she tried to ignore it, it lingered. Sienna's suspicion grows. That evening, Sienna couldn't shake the memory of Alvin's cryptic question. Evan, oblivious to her unease, seemed more present than usual, offering to cook dinner, pouring her a glass of wine, even joking about the disastrous attempt they'd made at baking a cake together during their honeymoon. He made her laugh, but the nagging feeling wouldn't leave. Later, as they cleaned up the dishes, Sienna decided to test the waters. "I ran into Alvin at the market today," she said, keeping her tone casual. Evan stiffened, though he tried to hide it by focusing on drying a plate. "Oh yeah? What did he say?" "Not much," Sienna replied, watching him closely. "He's nice, a little Intense, though. Evan's chuckle sounded forced. That's just Alvin. Always has to make an impression. She nodded, filing his reaction away in her mind. As they settled onto the couch to watch a movie, Sienna couldn't help but notice how quickly Evan's hand slipped away from hers, as though the contact made him uncomfortable. When he fell asleep before the credits rolled, she stared at his peaceful face, a knot of worry tightening in her chest. The revelation. The evening felt unusually quiet. Sienna sat in the living room, flipping idly through a book she wasn't reading. The sound of water running upstairs reminded her that Evan was still in the shower. She glanced at his phone sitting on the coffee table, the screen dark. He must have forgotten it there when he went upstairs. She tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the book in her lap. But Alvin's cryptic question from the market kept looping in her mind. Do you ever wonder if Evan tells you everything? Her gaze drifted back to the phone. The air in the room seemed heavier, charged with the weight of what she might find. She hesitated, her fingers trembling as she reached for it. The passcode was no mystery. She'd seen him enter it countless times. She unlocked the screen and began scrolling through his messages. She almost stopped when she saw Alvin's name. Almost. Alvin. I can't keep doing this, Evan. You need to tell her. Evan. I will, just not yet. Alvin. She deserves the truth. We all do. Evan. I love her, Alvin. Alvin. And me? The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. She reread the conversation, hoping there was some other explanation, but none came. The truth stared back at her, undeniable. The sound of the shower turning off jolted her out of her thoughts. She barely had time to put the phone down before Evan appeared at the top of the stairs, a towel around his waist and another slung over his shoulders. Sienna? He called out, his voice light, unaware of the storm brewing below. In here, she replied, barely recognizing her own voice. Evan appeared in the doorway moments later, his hair damp and curling slightly at the ends. He smiled at her, but it faded when he saw the look on her face. His gaze shifted to the phone sitting on the table. Sienna, he began, stepping into the room, his tone careful, almost pleading. How long? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Evan froze, the color draining from his face. It's not what you think, he said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Then what is it, Evan? Sienna's voice rose, trembling as she pointed toward the phone. Because from what I'm reading, it sure looks like you're in love with someone else, and not just someone, Alvin. The confrontation. Evan sat on the edge of the couch, his head in his hands. Sienna paced the living room, her emotions oscillating between heartbreak and fury. Why, Evan? She demanded, her voice shaking. Why did you marry me if you couldn't let him go? I thought I could, Evan admitted, his voice low and heavy. I thought if I committed to you, if I gave us everything I had, it would be enough. And for a while, it was. But Alvin, he's always been there. Sienna's laugh was bitter, sharp. And me? Was I just some picture-perfect wife to cover up what you really wanted? No! Evan's voice rose, desperate now. You're not a cover. I love you, Sienna. I married you because I wanted a life with you. Then why couldn't you be honest? She snapped, her arms wrapping tightly around herself as if to hold the pieces of her breaking heart together. Why couldn't you tell me what I was stepping into? The room fell silent, tension thick in the air. Before either could speak again, there was a sharp knock at the door. Evan and Sienna exchanged a glance, neither moving for a moment until the knock came again, louder this time. Evan opened the door to find Alvin standing on the porch, his expression tense. Alvin, Evan began, but the other man pushed past him into the house. This has gone on long enough, Alvin said, his voice firm and unapologetic. His dark eyes met Sienna's. You deserve to know everything. Sienna glared at him, her tear-streaked face flushed with anger. I think I figured out enough on my own, thanks. Alvin shook his head. Not even close. The night was heavy with tension as Evan and Alvin stood by the car, the engine running. Sienna had been watching from the window, her heart pounding. She couldn't hear their words, but their body language spoke volumes. Evan's shoulders tense, Alvin's hands gesturing with frustration. The conversation seemed to escalate, and then it happened. Evan reached out, pulling Alvin close. Their kiss was brief, but charged. A bittersweet farewell more than an invitation. Sienna's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled back from the window, her chest tightening. Her mind raced, disbelief mixing with anger and heartbreak. Before she could think, she grabbed her coat and stormed out the door. As she approached the car, Evan saw her first. His blue eyes widened with shock and guilt as he pushed away from Alvin. "Sienna!" he called, stepping toward her. She froze, the image of the kiss replaying in her mind like a cruel loop. "You're unbelievable!" she spat, her voice trembling with rage. Without another word, she turned on her heel and marched back into the house. The confrontation. Evan rushed after her, leaving Alvin standing by the car. The house was dark when he entered, except for the faint glow of a lamp in the living room. Sienna stood by the mantel, her hands gripping the edge, her head bowed as tears streamed down her face. "Sienna, please," Evan started, his voice breaking. "Let me explain." She whirled around, her green eyes blazing. "Explain? What could you possibly say, Evan? That it wasn't what it looked like? That you were just saying goodbye?" Evan hesitated, his silence damning. "I gave you everything," she said, her voice trembling. "I believed in us. And the whole time you were still tied to him?" Evan stepped closer, his hands outstretched. "I love you, Sienna. I chose you. That's what tonight was about. I was saying goodbye to him. For good." Before Sienna could respond, the front door creaked open. Alvin stepped inside, his expression cautious but resolute. "He's telling the truth," he said quietly, his dark eyes meeting hers. Sienna's body tensed, her hands balling into fists. "You have the nerve to come into my house? After everything you've done?" "I didn't come to fight," Alvin said, raising his hands in surrender. "I came to make it clear that Evan chose you. I'm leaving." The room felt like it was spinning for Sienna. Her gaze flicked between the two men, her emotions boiling over. The betrayal, the humiliation, the sheer weight of it all crushed her. Her eyes landed on the kitchen counter, where a knife sat within reach. Her gaze darted to the kitchen, where a knife sat on the counter. She had used it earlier that evening to slice an apple, leaving it forgotten next to the cutting board. Now, it gleamed under the harsh kitchen light, its presence commanding her attention. Alvin took a step forward, his hands raised, his voice calm but firm. "Sienna, I know this is hard to hear, but you have to understand. I'm not here to take anything from you. Evan chose you." The words only poured gasoline on the fire raging inside her. "You don't get to stand there and act like this is okay," she shouted, her voice raw. "You ruined everything. My marriage, my life, everything." Evan moved between them, his blue eyes wide with desperation. "Sienna, stop. Please, let's just talk about this. I love you, I swear I do." But Sienna wasn't listening anymore. Her feet carried her toward the kitchen without conscious thought. Her hand closed around the knife, the cool steel grounding her in her spiraling rage. Alvin's dark eyes flicked to the blade, his expression shifting from regret to alarm. "Sienna," he said, his voice low and steady now. "Put that down, please." "You don't get to tell me what to do!" she screamed, her voice cracking. Tears streamed down her face as her grip on the knife tightened. "You don't get to just walk away from this like you're the victim." Evan stepped forward cautiously, his hands outstretched. "Sienna, listen to me. You don't want to do this. Just put it down, okay?" Her breathing came in ragged gasps, her vision blurred by tears and rage. "You don't get to decide what I want, Evan. Neither of you do." And then it happened. With a surge of emotion, she lunged toward Alvin. The blade pierced his side, the sickening sound of metal meeting flesh cutting through the room's silence. Alvin's eyes widened in shock, his hands instinctively going to the wound as he staggered backward. "No!" Evan screamed, rushing to catch him as he fell. Alvin collapsed onto the floor, blood seeping through his shirt and pooling beneath him. Sienna's hand went slack, the knife slipping from her grip and clattering to the ground. She stumbled back, her legs giving out as she sank to the floor. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, her voice hollow, her hands trembling. "I didn't mean to." Evan knelt beside Alvin, pressing his hands to the wound in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me, Alvin," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "Please, stay with me." But Alvin's breaths grew shallower, his gaze unfocused. Within moments, his body went still, and Evan's sobs filled the room. Sienna stared at the scene before her, frozen in shock and horror, as the gravity of what she had done began to sink in. The aftermath. The flashing lights of police cars bathed the street in red and blue as officers moved methodically through the house. Sienna sat on the couch, her hands cuffed in front of her face pale and blank. Her eyes were fixed on the blood-stained carpet, the reality of her actions still too much to process. Evan sat nearby, his shirt smeared with Alvin's blood, his head in his hands. He answered the officer's questions in a daze, his voice monotone and heavy. At the trial, the courtroom was packed. The prosecution painted a grim picture of that fateful night, emphasizing Sienna's rage and the deadly escalation. Officer Gerald Price, one of the first responders, testified. "When we arrived, the scene was chaotic. The victim was unresponsive on the living room floor, and the defendant was sitting nearby, visibly distraught but cooperative. The suspect admitted to the stabbing, stating repeatedly that she didn't mean to. The defense, led by Sienna's lawyer, argued that the act was one of passion, fueled by emotional distress from Evan's betrayal. "My client was not in her right mind that night," her lawyer stated. "She acted out of an uncontrollable flood of emotions, driven by betrayal and humiliation. This was not premeditated." Evan's testimony was the most compelling. He recounted the events leading up to the stabbing, his voice trembling as he admitted his role in the tragedy. "I hurt her in ways I can never take back," he said. "What happened that night was my fault as much as anyone's. Sienna wasn't herself. She was broken. Because of me." The prosecution cross-examined him sharply. "Are you suggesting, Mr. Blake, that your actions absolve her of responsibility for taking a life?" Evan's response was quiet but firm. "No. But you can't understand what she was going through unless you understand what I put her through." After days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty of manslaughter. The judge, recognizing the emotional turmoil and lack of premeditation, sentenced Sienna to 3 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation. "This was a tragedy on every level," the judge said during sentencing. "But the law recognizes the role that emotional duress played in this crime.